Hi, everyone. I see we have about 20 people in here. It's really nice to see all your faces, although it's not nice to see your faces at the same time, because it's likely that you're here because you have metastatic breast cancer. My name is Julia Maues. I have been living with MBC for a little over 8 years now. And we're here to talk about clinical trials in MBC. So I have only lived for this long because of clinical trials and because people before me decided to join a clinical trial. So most people, and that includes me, have this understanding of clinical trials that they're this that you could possibly get substandard treatment if you enroll in a clinical trial. And I have learned that that is not the case in oncology. Even if you are in the control arm of the clinical trial, meaning you're not getting the treatment that is being tested, you will receive standard of care. And if you are in the treatment arm, then you're going to receive standard of care and possibly plus a new experimental promising treatment. So I have a friend, Shantae Drakeford, and she put it best when she said, I used to think of clinical trials as experimental, and now I realize that they are revolutionary. So I'm going to introduce you to Susan Colen. Susan runs breastcancertrials.org, and they have a special part of the site that is dedicated to metastatic breast cancer. So thank you, Susan.
Thank you, Julia. And I'm going to share my screen. So thanks a lot, Julia, for that intro and info. I am Susan Colen, as Julia said, Program Director of breastcancertrials.org. I'm honored to be here to talk to you today about clinical trials. My goal for this session is to talk a little bit about clinical trials in general, and then when to consider a trial and how to find a trial. And also leave some time after discussion or to answer any questions that you might have. So first, a little about me. I began working at breastcancertrials.org in 2009. And I decided at that time to change my career and my focus and to work in some way towards improving treatment for cancer. I had lost my mother to breast cancer when I was 5, and I lost my father to melanoma when I was 10. And by the time I was 42, I had already surpassed the age of both of my parents. And I realized that if either of them got cancer in 2009 instead of in the 1960s, due to clinical trials and the advances in treatment since then, they might still be here today. So my interest and my passion is in providing education and access to information about clinical trials and to make it easier for people to find, understand, and consider trials for themselves, and also to help move the needle. Every advance in treatment has been the result of a clinical trial, or in other words, there would be no new or better treatments without them. For example, without clinical trials, Herceptin, aromatase inhibitors, CDK inhibitors, and immunotherapy wouldn't be readily available for people with metastatic breast cancer today. And readily available also means covered by insurance. So what are clinical trials? A trial is a carefully designed study that looks at new medical approaches work in people. A medical approach includes new drugs or therapies like a chemotherapy or a targeted therapy. It also includes new combinations of drugs. or using procedures like surgery or radiation for Mets. And all clinical trials are designed to ask a specific question, such as, is a treatment safe? Does it have side effects? How much should people take and how often? And is it any better than treatments that are already available? And why should you consider a clinical trial? Trials provide expanded options, especially if the standard of care isn't working. And you have access to potential new and promising treatments, tomorrow's drug today. You may receive a combination of drugs that are already to work that are being studied to see if they work better together. Or you might receive a drug that's already approved, but given at a different time point in the treatment process. So maybe it is the first treatment instead of the fourth or fifth. And also, participating in a trial allows you to contribute to knowledge about how or if a particular drug works, which will also help future patients as previous trial participants have helped us. And of course, there's also risks. It's important to remember that clinical trials are research, and the outcome of whether the drug will work for you is unknown. So when to consider a clinical trial? You can consider a clinical trial as an option for care at any time that you're discussing a new treatment or a change in treatment. You could think of trials in the same way and at the same time that you would consider any other standard of care treatment. There's trials available for people at all time points, for those who are newly diagnosed, and after receiving 1, 2, or more treatments. In other words, before as well as after running out of standard options. And it's important to consider clinical trials in long-term planning treatment, or long-term treatment planning, because the number and types of therapies you've already had will affect the types of trials you can later enroll in. Some trials require prior treatment or a specific treatment, while others require that you've had no prior treatment or no treatment with a specific drug or a type of drug. So for example, if you receive treatment with an immunotherapy drug like Keytruda, for example, you may become ineligible for another immunotherapy trial in the future. And some people might also like to read about trials even when they're not at a decision-making point. That way they can be informed about options should they need to make a treatment decision in the future. And there's also other types of trials in addition to treatment trials. There are imaging trials that are looking at monitoring how tumors are responding to treatment, predicting if a tumor will respond to treatment. There's a trial currently looking at using imaging to personalize the dose of hormone therapy, and also to see if your tumors express estrogen or PARP, for example, which can affect your treatment plan. And there's also symptom management and supportive care trials, including medications for heart or cardiac problems caused by long-term treatment, exercise and support for fatigue, and interventions to help with neuropathy. And there's also registries. These are generally surveys that are open to all people living with metastatic disease. These studies collect information that's used to help improve treatment and care. And this is a really good way for anyone to participate in research. Current registries that are available include the Metastatic Breast Cancer Project, MBC Connect, and the Cancer Experience Registry. Okay, so how do you find trials? Many people talk to their doctors, but we often hear that doctors don't tell them about trials, or they're not supportive of trials. And if your doctor isn't supportive or tells you that there aren't any trials for you, we always encourage people to get a second opinion and or to take it upon themselves to look for trials on their own. And some people actually prefer to start by researching trial options on their own to be informed and prepared before talking with their doctor. And the main way to find trials is on clinicaltrials.gov, which is a government website that lists all phase 2 and phase 3 and many phase 1 trials as required by the federal government. However, it's not a website that was designed for patients, and it's not easy for most people to use or search or understand. Which is why we started breastcancertrials.org in 2008. We're a nonprofit with the goal of making clinical trial information and trial searching easy for all patients with breast cancer. And this site supports trial matching for people at all breast cancer stages. So in 2015, we launched Metastatic Trial Search, which is a trial matching tool run by breastcancertrials.org that was designed by MBC patients and advocates to meet the specific needs of people living with metastatic disease. You can browse all the trials or answer a few questions about your diagnosis and match the trials based on that information. You can also filter trials based on your location, the type of trial, or on about 25 genomic markers such as BRCA, P10, or PI3K. And for the trial descriptions, we use the information from clinicaltrials.gov, but we rewrite the trial summaries and the trial titles in patient-friendly language, making it much easier to understand than the medical language typically used to describe trial information. And we're actually launching a new version of Metastatic Trial Search in a few weeks that will provide matching on a full treatment history, as well as the ability to create and save a profile. And that way you can check back regularly to update your profile and to easily find new trials that match your situation. We also produce a monthly publication related specifically to metastatic breast cancer research and clinical trials. Metatalk can be used as a way to stay updated on current research and to learn more about clinical trials in general. Each month, we focus on 4 to 5 different specific topics and carefully select unbiased, accurate, and patient-friendly information related to those topics, and we provide them in one place. We have an archive of over 100 topics, including research updates on breast cancer subtypes like triple negative, HER2 positive, hormone positive, HER2 low, and ER low, as well as other topics such as how to find metastatic breast cancer trials, how to talk to your doctor about clinical trials, and what are lines of therapy, what's a solid tumor trial, and many more. We also list all new trials added to the registry every month. And you can send Metastatic Trial Talk to get an email with a link to the new issue every month to stay updated on research, as well as new trials that are available. And we also suggest that patients work with other groups that help people find trials. The nonprofits and patient advocates that are doing this type of work are diverse by age, stage, race, and gender, and provide their services for free. Examples are Christine Hodgson at Storm Writers Network, Angel Mira's Center, who also provides services for Spanish speakers, Tiger Lily Foundation, the Chrysalis Initiative, and Susan G. Colen, amongst others. And there's also other trial finders available, or apps that provide trial matching, including Emerging Med, Citizen, National Cancer Institute, and Trialjectory. And I added metastatic trials search here as well because it's the back end for the MBC Connect trial matching feature. And it's also embedded on about 25 advocacy partner websites, including the Young Survival Coalition website. And it can be found in the resource section. So what do you do once you find a trial? We've had people contact us saying they found a trial they're interested in. Now, what do I do? We always recommend that you discuss trial options with your doctor. Examples of questions that you can ask are, do I have to go off my current medications while on this trial? How will this trial impact my treatment options going forward? Are there other trials besides this one that I should consider? How are trial costs covered? Would you still be my doctor? And if you were me, knowing what you know, would you join this trial? You can find additional questions to ask on Metastatic Trial Talk as well. And you can also look through Metastatic Trial Talk or online to find blog posts or interviews with people who have participated in clinical trials for metastatic breast cancer. Twitter has a supportive and informative MBC community where people often share their experience in trials. You can also follow us on Twitter. We post research updates regularly and also post the newest clinical trials. So participating in a trial is a personal decision and your decision to make. So make sure to ask any questions you have before joining the trial, so that you can continue to ask questions throughout the trial. And also know or remember that you can drop out of a trial at any time for any reason. And it's important to note that breastcancertrials.org doesn't promote enrollment in clinical trials. Our goal is to empower all people affected by breast cancer to learn about and consider all of their treatment options, including clinical trials, at every point as a routine option for care. So thank you so much for your attention. And available for any questions. I've also included my personal email here, as well as the email address for breastcancertrials.org and Metastatic Trials Search. If you have any questions about using our trial matching tools or would like assistance using our website, you can contact us at help-desk at bctrials.org or the phone number listed here. Thank you. And are there any questions?
So I'll read the first one. If you're assigned to an arm of a trial you don't want, so if you're in the standard treatment arm or the control arm, I imagine, will they ever let you withdraw or re-enroll to try your luck again at getting the experimental drug?
Well, so you can always drop out of the trial at any time. So I'll just do that. But often when you sign up for a trial, trials are often randomized and blinded, meaning that you probably wouldn't know which arm you're in. And all of this information will be explained to you before you agree to participate. It's really, so getting all that information in advance will help you make a decision about whether or not you want to participate. But again, you can always drop out for any reason at all. And I don't know, it's a good question if you can re-enroll. I actually don't know about.
I think once you have been enrolled, you're going to be in the database and then you can't re-enroll to try to get the other arm. But I think the most important thing is what Susan said. You can always drop out, absolutely. And like she said, you might not know if you're in the treatment arm. And importantly, your doctor will probably not know either. Even the people running the clinical trial, it's all blinded. The second question is, what would be the first step? I have a Facebook friend that just asked for clinical trials. And so what would be the first thing to do?
I would recommend looking on Metastatic Trial Search. It's you can get an idea of the trials that would be available for you, and if there's any trials that you might be interested in, and doing research elsewhere as well. So, you know, and I'm so gonna re-mention Static Trial Talk, which has information about the clinical trial process and about what's being studied currently in research. But going to Metastatic Trial Search, you can enter a few questions about your situation, or you can go directly to the trial listings and look through them for just to get an idea of what's out there, to sort of get information about maybe even how to talk to your doctor about trials. And then, definitely the second step would be to talk to your doctor about, or ask your doctor about trial options.
Yeah, I'd say even like at the very beginning, if there's a standard of care, that's definitely going to be what you're going to go on. Do let your doctor know that you are interested in clinical trials, if that's the case, because her or his decision of what treatment to recommend next, all of that will impact what trials you may be eligible for in the future. But if they have in the back of their mind, this person wants to explore clinical trials and possibly participate in the future, that will be something that they take into account. And also, many times doctors make assumptions about patients and they think, oh, this person wouldn't want to participate in clinical trials. She's a single mom, she won't have time, she can't travel. Well, you should make that decision for yourself and make sure you are very explicit when you communicate with your doctor about it. So another question is, if the trial is at stage 2 or 3, is it still possible you'll be getting a placebo?
So for phase 2 and 3 trials, for phase 3 trials, often they are looking at comparing the new drug versus the standard drug. So in phase 3 trials, you will always get at least the standard of care treatment, and the experimental arm would you would get the new drug, and the control arm you would get a placebo, but it would always be in combination with the standard of care that you might already get in anyway. And in phase, this is mostly for phase 3 trials. So I think when people worry about getting, or think they're just going to get a placebo, in cancer trials, you only receive a placebo. You will always receive at least the standard of care treatment. Did that answer the question?
Yeah, I think so. I'll just add that. So phase 1 is going to usually determine what's the safe dose of a drug. Phase 2 is going to start looking at efficiency, and both of those are definitely going to give you the treatment, the experimental drug. Phase 3 is where they compare what the standard of care is to the new treatment. And in oncology trials, it will always be the standard of care. So you're never going to get worse than that. And in metastatic breast cancer, the standard of care is probably not going to be nothing, right? So that will never be the case in metastatic breast cancer. For an early stage trial, it might be that the standard of care is to do nothing at that point. And then in that case, those patients will only get a placebo that doesn't actually do anything because the standard of care is do nothing. There are a couple of short questions, so I'll just jump to those. Are the trial search tools that Susan mentioned specific to the US or show trials in other countries? I'm in Canada.
They are specific to the US.
That is breastcancertrials.org. I know, for example, Storm Writers Network, Christine's does have internationals, and clinicaltrials.gov will have international trials. It's frustrating as clinical trials were never discussed with me at the time of diagnosis. And now I feel I don't have accessibility to promising drugs going forward that target a specific mutation that I have.
You can always look for trials at any point. So I would say to still, talk to your doctor now. And as Julia said earlier, be really clear that you're interested in trials, and, going to metastatic trial search, looking at options that might, that you might be interested in, and bringing those with you to the doctor is a good starting point. But you can always, there's trials at every point. So it is definitely still an option.
And sorry, there was a first part to that question that I read the second part first, but she started with, I'm finding that I'm excluded from a lot of clinical trials that I'm interested in, as the participant must not have had fulvestrant as the trial drug is paired with this. Do some trials ever consider exceptions if there's some push from the oncologist?
I think the answer is yes. I absolutely worth continuing and that conversation.
Yeah, I mean, if a trial has a specific exclusion, like you can't have taken fulvestrant, it's unlikely that they're going to let you go on the trial if you've taken fulvestrant. But there might be other trials looking at something that do allow that you took the drug. And then another very important thing is, outside of clinical trials, there's a mechanism called compassionate use. That is a way in which the FDA authorizes people to receive an experimental treatment outside of a clinical trial because there are specific reasons why they don't qualify for a clinical trial. And this is a perfect example. Like, I would really benefit from this drug. That's what it's looking like, but I don't qualify for the trial because I received drug X, or because I live really far away from the place where they're doing the trial, and I can't travel every 2 weeks to go get an infusion across the country. So all of those are reasons that are very, very valid to try to get access to a drug through compassionate use. 1 minute warning. One more question. Any suggestions for people who live in more remote areas? How many trials would allow treatment from outside the area? I live 5+ hours from an academic center and I'm still working.
That is definitely a problem and a challenge in the clinical design, the trial design process. And I think that there are, movement towards expanding trial research site options. There's something called just-in-time trials, where it's bringing trials to the research site or the clinic if there's patients there that might be eligible or interested in. So I think that's going to be changing a little bit more down the road, but it is definitely a barrier requiring people to go to the site and there's so many other options for doing some of the treatments at the local site. So I think that's trial heading that way. Yeah,
we really need to do better, or they need to do better. We're working on that as advocates, and speak up. I think it's very important to speak up. So we're out of time. Thank you for all of those who joined. Susan shared her email, so continue asking questions. It was nice to see you all. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Oh, and you're going to go see the exhibit hall next. Sorry, I should have said that earlier.